Three, two. Welcome to another episode of Million Dollar Stories, where we get to interview authors from all over the world. I love learning about significant people in our history, people like Milton Friedman. And there's a guy out here who wrote a book about a school in Chicago that pretty much combines many of the great minds that we look up to this day. His name is Johann van Overveld. And the book, are you ready for this, guys? You guys are going to like this. If you're any bit of a historian like myself, the book is called The Chicago School: How the University of Chicago Assembled the Thinkers who Revolutionized Economics and Business. Thank you so much for being here, Johann.
My pleasure.
Well, let's start off with the genesis of this book. You obviously, I think you look up to a guy that I look up to, Milton Friedman. You have him on the cover of the book. What made you want to write about this?
Well, it goes back several decades, but during the 90s, so more than 30 years ago, the question in October of each year was not who is going to get the Nobel Prize in Economics. The question then was who from the University of Chicago will get a Nobel Prize this year. And that was so striking that one after another, Merton Miller, Jim Heckman, a lot of other people, Robert Vogel, all people from the University of Chicago got a Nobel Prize. So the question arose, how does it come that a relatively small faculty of economics at the University of Chicago, for example, Stanford and Harvard have much larger faculties than Chicago, is so dominant in economic science? That was actually a little bit the starting point of my dive into the history and the tradition of Chicago and economics at the University of Chicago.
Now, were all these individual students, or they were all faculty members? I think Milton, was it Milton Friedman was a faculty member? Is that right?
Yeah, it's a combination, doing studies there, going away. Like, for example, Milton Friedman, who, amongst others, was at Columbia University in New York, but then returned. But what I found out was that there was an extreme emphasis on quality, because one of the reasons was that not a lot of people know that there used to be what is now called an old Chicago University that disappeared because it was mediocre. And so when nobody less than John Rockefeller started the new University of Chicago, the one we still see around today, the emphasis was on quality. Research, first of all, research. Teaching is also important, but research is more important, and we want to have the best. And that remained the Chicago tradition. And along the way, all these big names focused very much on a combination of applying price theory to whatever societal phenomenon that came along, and using empirical evidence to back up the theory. And that is still today the backbone of the Chicago school, rigorously applying price theory and going for empirical verification so that your theory has legs to stand up.
Hmm. So I want to talk a little bit about Milton Friedman in a moment, but the one that stood out while I was just going through your book was Ernest DeWitt Burton. You have a great way of explaining who he was and what he did, but left no doubt about the desirability of a fanatical work attitude. Can you tell us a little bit about this individual? Because I know nothing about him, but it seems like he was
Well,
significant.
like you said, he was one of the guys who instilled very much throughout the university, and certainly at the economics department, this work ethic, this necessity of being the best and being able to attract the best. And if that took working 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, well, then you just had to do it. It was as simple as that. Also coming from the times of DeWitt and others, is that saying in Chicago, you're only as good as your last paper. So it doesn't count that much in Chicago that you have a kind of curriculum vitae that is impressive. If your new papers are not good, you will know it. They will tell you, and they will incentivize you to do better with your next paper. So he is one of the figures that embodies that very much, and embodied it very early in the build-up of the Chicago tradition.
And so University of Chicago was founded in 1890, and the first president was William Rainey Harper. Is that right? And it sounds like this Harper guy had an impact on Burton. Maybe I have it backwards, but I'm looking at your book here. Tell us a little bit about William Rainey Harper, the first president of the University of Chicago. His vision, energy, brilliance, and zeal, coupled with a strong religious belief and a continuing commitment to his own research, left a lasting mark. So, was that in reference to Burton? Is that right?
Yeah, there were two things that stood out with Harper. First of all, he immediately realized that if he wanted to have a top university from the start, he would have to rate other universities and pick away the best minds there. So he went on a tour, and Cornell University, Harvard University, others were literally raided by him. And some of their best minds were attracted to Chicago. But that, of course, made it necessary for him to have the necessary means, financial means, to do that. And that's a second characteristic of Harper. One way or the other, he succeeded in, how should I say, keep the pressure on John Rockefeller. John Rockefeller started out with a budget that was rather modest, and Harper subtly obliged them to enlarge the budget step by step, so that Harper had the means to attract the top people that he had in mind for the for the University of Chicago.
So
So
Rockefeller,
Harper,
Rockefeller funded this University of Chicago out of the gate.
yeah. He's the founding father, although he never set foot on the campus. He never set foot on the campus. He did so intentionally, because he didn't want to to somehow create the impression that he also determined what was going on intellectually and in terms of research. But the millions of dollars that came that were needed to start this new university came from him. And it was Harper who was very instrumental in pushing Rockefeller, who sometimes got very angry, but at the end of the day always followed Harper.
Wow, I had no idea. I did a quick little glance through Google and all that. I didn't come across anything about Rockefeller.
Well,
Wow,
it
that is
is. It's all in my
fascinating.
book. It's all in my book.
Wow, that is interesting. So the reason why Rockefeller wanted to have this university was simply what? To just create the next generation of great minds, or
Well,
what was his
it's a little
intention?
bit, it's also religious, because he was a Baptist, and there was no Baptist university in the Midwest at that point in time. And he chose Chicago to have that university, and he put the money behind it. It's as simple as that. It was born out of religious conviction.
Wow. I know he went through some type of life-changing moment with a train accident, and he became even more devout with his religion. And it seems like he had this awakening, very much like Carnegie did, to start giving back and I guess maybe helping other people become
Yeah.
successful. So
Well, I
interesting.
don't remember at the top of my head the number. It is in the book, the dollars that he put into the university, but it was certainly for that moment. At the end of the 19th century, it was a huge amount of money that he put in the university, and also not only money, but a nose for choosing the people who could build that kind of university. And like I said earlier, William Harper was certainly among the most significant people in building Chicago to what it is today, and as certainly in economics as one of the most successful, if not the most successful university on earth.
Wow. So I'm looking at your book right now. By 1910, Rockefeller had spent $35 million building the University of Chicago. Adjusted for inflation, I can't even imagine what that is to this day. That is
That
wild.
would today be billions and billions.
Oh my God. That is insane. That's very interesting. Okay, so
But he was a rich man, you know.
yeah, yeah. At the time, I think he was the richest man that ever lived, right? So I think maybe even to this day, he's still the wealthiest man. If they're, he'd be wealthier than potentially um, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. So fascinating. Okay, um, let's go back to Milton, just so I know we're kind of pressed on time. Milton Friedman to me is one of the great economists of our world, and I just look up to him. I agree with many things that he has said, and I'm just fascinated with him. So, is there anything that you can convey to our audience that really blew you out of the water whenever you came across his life and how instrumental he was within University of Chicago?
Well, I met him several times. Once in Chicago, which he left in 1978. He retired, went to San Francisco, was still quite active at the Hoover Institution. I met him once in Chicago, very early in my career. Actually, I just left college in Belgium when I came to Chicago the first time as a journalist, and then I met him afterwards twice in San Francisco. He was a really electrifying guy. Although not that huge in terms of length, but in terms of
Short guy.
intellectual
He was very tiny guy,
capacity.
wasn't he?
Yeah, very tiny. Like his wife, Rose Friedman, who was even tinier than him, but they were both intellectual giants. And Friedman was also a very friendly, sweet man, absolutely not somebody who was not nice in discussion. On the contrary, and who just could make wonderful reasonings in terms of the logic of it, and keeping to the logic and taking the logic to its full extent. He was a master at that, and the saying in the 50s and the 60s was that if you went into a debate with Milton Friedman, you were just lost in advance. It was the best you could hope for is to draw the debate with Friedman, but he had such a quick mind and such an iron logic that he applied all the time, that debating Friedman was a nightmare. Paul Samuelson, another big shot from the history of economics, used to say to me that everybody had the shakes when they had to debate Milton Friedman.
Did you agree with many things that he said then and now?
Yes, because Milton, I once asked him what at the end of the day for him economics was all about, and his answer was economics has to answer the question, why do people do what they do? This is important because it tells you that in contradiction with what most people think, Milton Friedman was first and foremost a microeconomist, a price theorist, who studied human behavior, consumption behavior, saving, all that kind of stuff. And through that study came through macroeconomics to monetarism, monetary policy, and things like that. So yes, I mean the way in which he studied consumption, the way in which he studied the relationship between inflation and money, the way in which he studied the business cycle, are things that are still relevant today. Sometimes people have the impression that they are outdated, but then something like the financial crisis or things like that happen, and then a lot of people start to go back to those basic elements of Friedman's insights.
Yeah, his explanation of inflation and his ability to communicate that to the masses for them to understand it is as simple as who creates inflation? The government when they print money. And it was so simple and so clear back then, and people are losing that fact. And I can't imagine what he is thinking nowadays, looking at what's happening in society. He was right all along because all they do is just keep printing that money. Um,
Yeah.
so,
Well,
was he, go
let
ahead.
me tell you one anecdote that goes back to 2005, which was then something like a year and a half before he died. That was my last visit to his apartment in San Francisco at the top of Taylor Street. And we had a very nice discussion, and he was very happy with the project of the book, which was then published 2 years later. And before I left, he said, "Just wait a minute, Johan. I want you to read something." And he went to his office and pulled out 2 or 3 pages. I started reading it, and I found it. Mind you, it was the end of 2005. I started reading it and did not exactly understand well what was in it, but I realized 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, because he was describing the scenario of the great financial crisis
In
2 years
2008.
and a half in advance. I still could slap myself many times not having asked a copy of what he had written, because that would today, I'm absolutely sure, a historical document. At the end of 2005, Friedman was describing the basic elements of what 2 to 3 years later would become the great financial crisis.
Wow. So you
Yeah,
became great friends with Milton Friedman. You were able to just visit him, just talk about economics and life in general. And he was as fascinating as we all hoped he is or was, right? So that's pretty cool. I mean, you don't see too many economists really stand out and shock the world like he did. He was able to
yeah,
motivate
absolutely.
and clarify his message, and nobody can do that nowadays. So
You know the anecdote about his visit at the White House?
no.
That was during the Nixon presidency when they tried to control inflation, and the George Shultz was at that time Secretary of the Budget in the Nixon administration, and George Shultz was before that Dean of the Business School in Chicago. So he knew Friedman very well, and in the hope to convince Nixon that price and wage controls were not a good way to control inflation, he invited Friedman to the White House. So they had a talk, and then they went out, and the press was there. And Nixon was saying, "Well, I had the pleasure to talk to Professor Friedman, but Mr. Friedman should know." I'm quoting Nixon now, that he should not blame George Shultz for the price and wage controls, which Friedman thought were useless to fight inflation. And Friedman looked at Nixon and he said, "No, Mr. President, I don't blame George. I blame you for that." It was all over the press during days. Milton Friedman attacks President Nixon, etc., etc.
Wow, man, the guy had courage and he stood up for his beliefs and I don't know his ins and outs on the gold standard being removed, and I guess he was completely against it. I'm assuming. I don't know all the details, but
Well,
it's great.
as far as I know, he was not very clear on that. But what he advocated, a fixed rule of money growth, money supply growth, basically is a gold standard. Of
Yeah.
course, central banks don't apply it. And as a matter of fact, during his life, especially during the last 10, 15 years of his life, he walked away a little bit on how should I say, the rigidity of that rule. But in terms of conceptual thinking about monetary policy and how to do it, he was close to a kind of gold standard logic. Uh, money is too important to give it into the hands of the politician, not even to give it into the hands of central bankers. So just apply a fixed money growth rule, and that is maybe not optimal, but it's better than the alternatives that are available to run your economy, or better to run the monetary side of your economy.
Yeah. I would love to know his thoughts on crypto and what he's seeing out there and how basically taking control or power away from the government in some fashion might be a very beneficial thing because anytime you print, obviously it devalues the dollar. And I thought he was completely against that. So when you look at something like Bitcoin, a completely new currency, what would he think of it? I'd love to ask him that. Um, when it
Well,
comes to, go ahead.
Friedman loved competition, so he probably would have loved cryptocurrency as a principle. Although, of course, if you look at what money should do, a store of value, a medium of exchange, etc., then of course Bitcoin becomes a little bit problematic because of the huge variation in its valuation.
Very volatile.
Just
Yes.
imagine that we would have in the supermarket prices in bitcoins. That would be a crazy world at this point in time. But apart from that, anything that contributed to healthy open competition was certainly always and everywhere greeted by Milton Friedman.
Hmm. So when it comes to the school itself, what do you attribute their success to? Was it just their high standards? Was it their culture? Or was it the brand that we only accept the best, therefore we attract the best? What did you find out?
Well, all these elements, only attracting the best, applying rigorously price theory, insisting on empirical verification, having a seminar system that was ferocious. If you went with the paper to Chicago and you sailed through in one piece, then you had a very good paper. You could be absolutely sure. But then at the end of the day, and that's how they got all these Nobel Prizes, that whole system produced a lot of unique contributions. I cannot name them all, but I already referred to Friedman and what his analysis of consumption, for example, the economics of information, the economics of crime, the economics of discrimination, law and economics, the rational expectations revolution, a lot of developments in finance, all came out of Chicago. All came out of Chicago. So if you want the answer, why has the school been so important? Well, because they had a tradition of quality, insisting on quality, top quality, price theory, empirical verification. And the result was a long list of breakthroughs, important new insights from different contributors, which at the end of the day produced Nobel Prizes. Although a lot of these developments or these new thoughts were described as crazy when they first popped up in Chicago. 10, 20 years later came the recognition that indeed this was path-breaking work and deserved an important place in the history of economic thought.
Hmm. You know, I heard that great quote. It's you don't get what you want, you get what you put up with. And Tony
Yeah.
Robbins has a great quote where it says, where he says that you are a product of your standards, plain and simple. And so having high standards will produce incredible, quality simply because all the people who are just tire kickers or people who don't take it seriously are going to be filtered out. And so if you attract the best and you keep that standard in place, individuals will be extremely proud to maybe excel at that school amongst their peers. So, is
Now,
there,
it is now, of course, interesting to see, and that's why I'm starting to think about writing a follow-up to my book on the Chicago School. What will be happening now? What is happening there now, and what will be happening in the coming years? Because you had that great line or that line of great economists, Jacob Weiner, Frank Knight, Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Gary Becker, Bob Lucas, uh, and all these guys are dead now. Bob Lucas died last year. Becker died something like 8 or 9 years ago. Friedman was somewhat longer. And so, who's the new big guy or big woman? Uh, is the process continuing? Is Chicago reinventing itself or not? These are intriguing issues which I would very much like to take the time to study more in depth and to see what has become uh, in the third decade of the 21st century of that hugely influential Chicago school.
Yeah, my only assumption is that the standards have dropped, and I don't think that does anybody any good. So when you find
Well,
out that answer, come back with
I'm
that
not so
book.
sure of that. I'm not so sure of that.
Really?
As a matter of fact, I was at the campus. You won't believe it, but it's true. Last week, for 3 days, spoke to several people. I'm still impressed by the way in which they focus on research and do really hard work. What I notice, and that might give a shift, is that now, of course, with the huge amounts of extra data that become available, that the purely empirical research is taking the upper hand,
Hmm.
and that sound theoretical work, which is also important, and I stress sound theoretical work because you can do theory for the theory. That's for me not sound. Sound theory means theory based in what is happening in the world, where you try to reflect upon it and build on the basis of specific observations a general insight. Um, I have the impression, and that's certainly true for whole of economics, but maybe also for Chicago, although I still give them the benefit of the doubt, that it might become too data oriented and not enough attention for sound theoretical work. I think that's a danger,
Hmm.
but it's too early to call or to tell. But it will be very interesting to see what will be happening in the coming years.
That's great. I know we're pressed for time, so we have to run. But one name outside of Milton Friedman for our audience to look up that really impressed you when you were doing the research on this. Is there a name that stands out?
Gary Becker.
All right, I don't know anything about him,
Gary,
so
he's the guy who applied, basically he applied economic reasoning, economic theory, price theory to sociological phenomena. He's the guy of the economics of crime, the economics of discrimination, the economics of the family. And so he took economics to a next level. And of course, you can disagree with that kind of analysis, but the basic point is that it was rigorous thinking, rigorous application of a body of economic theory that was well grounded over the decades and applied to non-traditional economic themes, like I said, crime, the family, and things like that. So
wow.
he would definitely, for me, be the continuation of that line, Stigler, Friedman, Becker.
I'm gonna look him up. I'm fascinated with great men and women of our past that changed this world. So I'll do some research. And I know you have to run. So Johan van Overveld, I have to say it's been an honor to talk with you, sir. Is there a website or social media channel that you recommend individuals look up and
Well,
find?
my latest book, which was published 2 years ago, called The Mystic Hand, The Mystic Hand of Central Bankers. And I have a website, The Mystic Hand in one word.com, where you can find more information on that book and other books, and where I now regularly publish blogs, let's say 2 or 3 blogs a month on 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 average on general economic issues, but with a special focus on central bankers, inflation, and monetary policy.
Wow. I bet you have read The Creature from Jekyll Island, I'm assuming. Have you read that book?
Sorry, I didn't get the name of the person who you were referring to.
The Creature from Jekyll Island. Have you read that book at all?
No.
Oh, wow. Talks about the creation of central banks. All right. So you would love that. Look that book up, guys, if you're paying attention
Okay.
to The Creature from Jekyll Island, game changer. But he has a book out there, and I wish I would have asked him about this. But The Mystic Hand, we'll probably talk about this later. How central banks shape the 21st century global economy. Johan, Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And we share the same core values and beliefs, it seems like, in the capitalism. And I love that.
Okay. Thank you for having me, and all the best.
Absolutely. Remember, guys, $1 Million Book will lead to $1 million life.